Although it didn't use these same words, Chapter 3 starts us off with the same question that Chapter 2 asked. Can language be best understood from a nativist perspective or an anti-nativist perspective? So in order to answer this question, we start off by looking at syndromes, which are a set of symptoms that sort of occur together that suggest that there must be a basis in the genes. Now, the reason why this is important is that if there is some basis in the genes, then it suggests that language may have evolved as a specific cognitive structure. Indeed, if language did evolve as a specific cognitive structure, then it has to have some kind of, it has to be coded for in the DNA in order for it to have evolved. So, if disorders are genetic in nature, and a specific aspect of that syndrome or that disorder is that there's a language impairment, but general cognition is spared, then that suggests that there may be some specific area coded in the genes that enables us to use language. Similarly, we would look for a syndrome that had spared language but impaired general cognition. And if we could find examples of these two kinds of syndromes, then we could point to those syndromes and suggest that there is what's called a double dissociation between general cognitive abilities and linguistic abilities. Now, by double dissociation, I mean that that each of them are dissociated from each other, that they are each independent and function on their own operating system. In order to answer this question, the first syndrome that the author of our text looks at is Williams syndrome. On first brush, Williams syndrome appears to provide evidence that people can experience a general cognitive impairment without losing their ability to master language. For instance, the individuals who have this syndrome will answer questions like, would you rather have 50 pennies or $5 incorrectly? Or when we ask them how long a bus is, they might say 3 inches or 100 inches maybe. Or another one said 2 inches, 10 feet, suggesting that they're especially incapable of answering kinds of numeric questions and following recipes, balancing a checkbook, especially those kinds of skills. But we also find that they're impaired in other general cognitive kinds of ways, that they have lower IQs than the average person in the population, ranging from about 50 to 70 on average. And if you know anything about IQ scores are typically 100, and that's the average IQ score, with a standard deviation of 15. So these individuals are at least 2 standard deviations below the mean, perhaps as far as 3. In other words, they're in about the 5th percentile in academic performance in their intelligence. The reason why this syndrome has garnered such attention from language researchers, though, is that despite people with Williams syndrome inability to answer questions that rely on general intelligence, they have what seems to be pretty advanced linguistic skills. For instance, we read on page 59 that when asked what a vampire was, one person with Williams syndrome said, "A man who climbs into ladies' bedrooms at night and sinks his teeth into their necks." When asked why vampires behave in this way, she responded, "Vampires must have an inordinate fondness for necks." It sounds like this person has a very good sense of humor, and they know the word inordinate, and they can speak in a very coherent and comprehensible manner. So this seems to suggest that the underlying cognitive constructs that support intelligence and language might be separate. However, some subsequent research has suggested that that might not be the case. In the first language-based research studies of Williams syndrome, Bellucci made a comparison between those with Williams syndrome and those with Down syndrome. That might not have been a very good comparison, though. If we look at individuals who have the same mental age as those with Williams syndrome, and we compare their cognitive skills and their linguistic skills, we find that people with Williams syndrome actually have approximately equivalent or age-appropriate language skills. So an individual with Williams syndrome might be an adult but have the mental capacity of a 6-year-old. But 6-year-olds actually have pretty advanced language skills, and so somebody with Williams syndrome would have to have very advanced language skills indeed, something closer to their own chronological age, in order to demonstrate that they had advanced language skills but impaired intelligence. And that's just not what we see. Rather, Williams syndrome looks like it might be actually a selective impairment of visual spatial skills in numeric tasks. Another complicating factor here might be that individuals with Williams syndromes are using complicated words in advanced ways, but that they may not understand the words as well as they appear to at first brush. Our author makes an interesting point, though, that individuals with Down syndrome may actually be underperforming on their language skills compared to their mental age, which itself is a fact that demonstrates that maybe there is some dissociation between intelligence and language skills. So whereas Williams syndrome was originally posited as evidence of a double dissociation, we find that Down syndrome actually provides better evidence of such a dissociation. In further search of a double dissociation, some researchers have looked to specific language impairment, which is a disorder that doesn't appear to have any apparent genetic basis, but does have a hereditary component. And that, again, is important because if language did in fact evolve as a unique cognitive construct in the brain, then we would expect there to be some kind of genetic component, and the hereditary nature of this disorder suggests that it may have one. Again, at first glance, this disorder appears to provide support for the thought that there might be a double dissociation. Individuals who have this disorder, as the name suggests, experience specific language impairment, such that they struggle with certain kinds of grammatical markers. They would say sentences like, "Who did Marge see someone?" or "Yesterday I fall over." They don't understand, especially, markers that can be added to the end of words to make them either plural or past tense, and they struggle to parse out sentences that are grammatically complex. The problem with understanding SLI as evidence of a double dissociation is, first of all, that these individuals have many non-linguistic deficits as well. I mean, sure, they're being brought in by their parents to see a doctor because of the linguistic deficits, but when the doctor does some further testing, the doctors usually are able to find that there are other difficulties as well, as outlined at the bottom of Table 3.1 on page 62 of your text. So, for instance, they're not able to perceive rapid stimuli, not just specific to language, but any rapid stimuli. So, because language is, by its very nature, a sequence of rapid stimuli, it might be that this is not a language-specific impairment, but rather the inability to perceive rapid stimuli. They also have difficulties with working memory. It's possible that this is the very foundation of SLI. As we'll read in Chapter 4, infants are notoriously brilliant at calculating statistical probabilities of the sounds they hear from their parents' speech patterns. These individuals with SLI probably have an inability to perform those same kinds of statistical calculations because of their poor working memory. So whereas an ordinary developing infant might be able to remember that in the past he or she has always heard at the end of the word fat, to make it plural, a sound that sounds like fats, and the end of the word fad has always heard the z sound, fads, to make it plural, and that infant will be able to, based on its previous experience, produce the correct plural sounds going forward into the future. But individuals with SLI struggle to make that connection between the proper use of plural markers and past tense markers, and so they may just leave them off altogether, or they may use them inconsistently or incorrectly. The explanation of a working memory impairment can also account for the fact that these individuals can't process grammatically complex sentences. An example is seen on page 64, where the sentence reads, "The horse was chased by the man." In this situation, the little words markers that are "was" and "by" make the second sentence distinguish from the first sentence, "The horse chased the man." And those two little words, which aren't emphasized, can be grammatically difficult to parse if you have a poor working memory that doesn't allow you to remember the correct syntactic order of words in your native language. So it's possible that SLI is not really a specific language impairment so much as it is a general working memory impairment that has implications for the language development. One final note here is that these individuals with SLI can't differentiate between certain sounds like ba and pa with a B or a P. Interestingly, however, as you'll read later on in the text, you could see page 133 if you're interested, animals can make this distinction. And as we know, animals do not have the capacity for language. So if animals can do this, then that can't be necessarily linked with linguistic skills. So the inability to hear the differences between similar sounds is probably not a specific language impairment, but rather a general cognitive kind of impairment that has its roots in general cognition. Finally, dyslexia gives us some additional perspective about the underlying nature of genetic underpinnings of language. As you no doubt know, dyslexia is an inability to read properly. Individuals with dyslexia will mix up their letters as they're reading so that they read the word for as the word of. They particularly have difficulties with small words. They will see the word it and read it as to because they switch the order of the letters in their mind. Now, dyslexia has a strong genetic component, but it's impossible that we could have evolved a specific gene for reading because reading is such a new evolutionary invention. We've only been reading and writing in many societies for a couple of thousand years, and in some societies, not at all. And in some societies, we've been reading and writing in the general population for only a few hundred years. So it's very unlikely that we would have evolved a specific gene that allowed us to be able to read. Rather, as you see on page 65 in box 3.2, we likely evolved an ability for phonological awareness. This is a general mechanism that we see many animals have evolved the capacity for as well. And so we probably have some gene that allows us to have phonological awareness, and this phonological awareness is especially necessary in the process of reading. This suggests to us that even if we were to find some strong evidence that a specific syndrome with a genetic underpinning were causing specific language impairments or were causing specific cognitive skills and sparing language skills, that we still couldn't conclude that that was a specific evolved cognitive mechanism because of what we see in the case of dyslexia.